Floyd Mayweather has a career that spans almost seems to be infinitely, considering that he continues to fight today in these exhibition style fights, whether it's against the next up and coming celebrity or he's looking to fight against somebody who is just really just out there that makes him a lot of money. But for Floyd Mayweather's boxing career, it spans just about 20 years worth of experience, and it pretty much holds over 20 world champions that have been part of his resume. Now, the interesting part about Floyd Mayweather is that he's just about ruined every fighter that he's faced, but there is one person in that resume of champions that he's fought, or just guys that he's fought, that has not only been better after fighting him, but they've accomplished a lot more than what they did prior to fighting him. So with this video, we're going to take a deeper look at not only the fighters that Floyd Mayweather has fought and how they fared before and after him, but we're also going to break down the statistics and probabilities of what those fighters' careers looked like prior to fighting Floyd and after Floyd, and how it kind of shows us a different, deeper situation with Canelo Alvarez. Now, ultimately, my goal of this video is to be mostly educational and informative, while there is a little bit of a, how would I say, hypothesis of this video, or in a way, a projection to it. These these pieces of information that you're going to see is roughly just what I was able to pull out in terms of looking at the internet and observing fighters, their resumes, the quality of their fights, and who they fought, and just do a basic sort of comparison to what Canelo has done. So let's dive right into it. So as you can see here, there are three columns. On the left-hand side, you have the fighter and their record before losing to Floyd Mayweather, the result of the Floyd Mayweather fight, and then their record after losing to Mayweather Jr. So why is this important? Well, you're going to see a lot of guys in red, and most of the guys that you're seeing in red either had a title going into the Floyd Mayweather fight, or they were perceived to be a champion despite not holding a legitimate title. Now, there are two outliers here. The first one is Diego Corrales, who many people consider to be, at the time, the betting favorite over Floyd Mayweather, and in some instances he was favored by knockout over Floyd. He was 33-0 and had recently relinquished his IBF super featherweight title before fighting Floyd. And then the other outlier is Shane Mosley, who captured the WBA title after beating Antonio Margarito, but that belt was not on the line when Shane fought Floyd. That was mostly due to Floyd not wanting to fight for the title as opposed to Mosley. And when Mosley lost to Floyd, that title became vacant. But we do have to spend a lot of time taking a look at what these resumes look like, and at the same time looking at who is the opponent and what is the result, and then what did the fighter look like afterwards. Now, of course, in the yellow here, between Victoriano Sosa and Henry Bussless, these two guys managed to go 7-1 after fighting Floyd. But the kicker here is that these guys never fought at the top level again. So the remaining fights that they took were mostly just fights that they did just to get paid. The remainder of the schedule here are guys who you can tell based on the win and loss column, these guys just didn't look the same as they did. But as you get to the bottom, you see that one specific outlier, which is Canelo Alvarez. Fighting Floyd Mayweather before, he was 42-0-1, which is 42 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw. And because he lost to Floyd by majority decision, afterwards he's gone 12-0-1. So 12 wins, 0 losses, and 1 draw. And while you can take the time to scrutinize what the wins were prior and after, the big difference here in comparison to Victoriano Sosa and Henry Bussless is that Canelo has fought at what would be considered to be a higher level, as opposed to those two fighters did after fighting Floyd. So we also have to do a little bit more deep diving into things. So when you look at Floyd and you look at his resume, a lot of people like to pick it apart, but what a lot of people are not spending their time realizing is that Floyd's resume is one of the best resumes that you'll probably see for a really long time in boxing, especially based on how we are looking at boxing in today's lens. The win percentage of all Mayweather opponents prior to fighting him was 89.7%. That means that if you were stepping into the ring versus Floyd, you had a 9 out of 10 chance that you had won all of your fights leading up to fighting him, which is very good odds. But as we see after fighting Floyd Mayweather, you only had a 59.2% chance of winning the following fights that you fought, which means that your percentage dipped a good 30.5%. And while 59.2% may seem to be better than half, in boxing, a fighter who wins 59.2% of his fights isn't what we would categorize as a legitimate like top level fighter. Whereas a fighter who wins nearly 90% of his fights would be considered a top level fighter. And there's a good chance if you've won 90% of your fights, you would more than likely be fighting for a world title, as opposed to if you finished your career after Floyd with nearly 60% of a win, you probably weren't fighting at the top level. But for Canelo Alvarez, we've seen not only has he fit the criteria of winning nearly 98% of the fights that he fought prior to Floyd, but he's won just about over 92% of the fights following Floyd. So rather than the large chunk of the 30.5% drop that the average Floyd Mayweather opponent would face, he's only faced a 5.4% drop. And that margin would shrink by 0.6 should he win against Anvil Yildirim, which is pretty much a foregone conclusion. So next we kind of have to do a little bit more of a deeper dive. Let's talk about just the championship level. So fights prior to Floyd for Floyd's opponents, they have fought and won nearly 80% of those fights. So 80% of the time you were winning a championship fight if you had fought prior to fighting Floyd. So not only did you have a 9 out of 10 chance of winning all your fights, but you had nearly an 80% chance of winning a championship fight before fighting Floyd. And of course, going back to the previous number, following Floyd, you only had about a 59% chance of winning a fight after fighting Floyd, but you only had a 34.8% chance of winning those championship fights after Floyd. It's amazing how you can see the steep drop in quality. You know, you actually had a better chance of winning fights after Floyd than winning championship fights after Floyd, considering that the percentage here is roughly about 44%. And then you look at the titles held prior to Floyd versus held after. Floyd Mayweather opponents held 55 titles prior to Floyd collectively, which means that 31.4% of the time, these guys were a champion. However, following Floyd, there were only about 11 titles being held, which statistically brings you down to 23.9%. So you had a 9 out of a 10 chance of winning every fight that you fought before fighting Floyd. You had nearly an 8 out of 10 chance of fighting a championship fight, and you had roughly 1/3 of those opportunities of holding a title prior to Floyd. So not just winning a title, but holding it in terms of the amount of titles that you can grab. But after Floyd, you only had a 59% chance of not only just winning, but you only had a 34% chance of fighting a championship fight, and only a 23.9% chance of holding a title afterwards. And then you look at Canelo Alvarez below, who was a massive outlier to it. So Canelo fought 7 times in a championship fight and won them all. He also fought nearly the same amount of fights afterwards. In fact, he fought more championship fights after Floyd, and he won 90% of them. And then you look at the titles, and this is one statistic that was kind of really interesting. Canelo actually underperforms in terms of holding titles prior to Floyd. And for some people, they may look at that as a reason to hypothesize that, well, it could just be because Canelo Alvarez was a younger fighter. And yes, a younger fighter has less of a probability of holding a title prior to Floyd. But the kicker here is that he absolutely destroys the norm afterwards. He actually has held the title 90% of the time that he has fought after fighting Floyd. So we have to look at those championship level fights before Floyd and then after Floyd. Now you look at the fights Canelo fought leading into Floyd Mayweather. Well, the championship fights, I should say. Fighting Matthew Hatton for the vacant WBC title, defending it against Ryan Rhodes, defending it against Alfonso Gomez, and defending it against Kermit Citron. Then he defends it again against Shane Mosley, defends it against Josecito Lopez, and then defends it while also winning the WBA 154 title. Now, the thing about the WBA's 154 title is we did not know if Floyd Mayweather would fight at the 154-pound weight class again, considering that he was considered to be the super champion because he defeated Miguel Cotto. And he defeated Miguel Cotto in 2012. The fight with Canelo and Austin Trout took place in 2014, and many people considered Canelo and Trout to be the legitimate champions of the division. And Trout had beaten Miguel Cotto for that very same title that Cotto lost to Floyd. So it was a legit unification fight between Canelo and Trout. And Canelo wins a slim decision. Many people felt that Austin Trout did perform much better than any other opponent that Canelo had fought up to that point. And then we take a look, well, before we do that, let's also look at the record of opponents. So before you fought Canelo Alvarez, you had an 88% chance of winning all your fights, which is not that far off from a lot of Floyd Mayweather opponents. So let's look at the championship fights that Canelo fought after Floyd. He fights Miguel Cotto for the 160-pound title, albeit at a catchweight, defends it at a catchweight against Amir Khan. But then he drops the title, obviously, because he felt he didn't need to fight Gennady Golovkin at that time, and moves down in weight again, this time fighting and winning the WBO's 154 title. But then he moves back up, this time challenging Gennady Golovkin for the WBA WBC title that he dropped and the IBF titles. And that fight ends in a draw, albeit I had Golovkin winning. Fights Golovkin in the rematch, and in the rematch, Gennady Golovkin loses this time, and Canelo picks up all three titles. But Canelo's not done there. He moves up another weight class to fight Rocky Fielding and wins the WBA's 168 title. And then he moves back down to middleweight and defeats Danny Jacobs, winning the WBA and WBC titles and recapturing the IBF title that he dropped in order to move up in weight. But he's not done yet. He then moves back up 2 weight divisions, and he defeats Sergey Kovalev for the WBO's 175 title. And then he drops back down a weight class, and he fights Callum Smith for the 168 title. And he's going to be defending those same titles in a couple of weeks when he fights Anvil Yildirim. So now we have to take a look at these records. So the record of opponents Canelo faced prior to Floyd, once again, was 244, 27, and 6 with an 88%. So you had an 88% chance of winning all your fights before fighting Canelo Alvarez. The record of Canelo's opponents that he faced following Floyd is a staggering 291, 13, and 4 for 94.5%. That means that the opponents that he's fought has not only won more fights than the guys that he fought prior to Floyd in championship fights, but they've also lost less fights, and they've had less fights that had no decision added to them. And of course, these include no contests and, of course, draws. That means that the level of opposition that he is fighting here vastly is superior to the level of competition that he's fought here. So let's look at what we can summarize. Well, that means that Canelo has won more title fights, won more titles, fought in more divisions, beaten better opposition since he lost to Floyd Mayweather. So many people ask, well, why the criticism for taking the Anvil Yildirim fight? And Mauricio Suleiman, who was on the Boxing Voice, clarified that this fight was not ordered by the WBC. So allow me to provide some clarity as to why Canelo is ultimately being criticized for the Yildirim fight. Let's look at the 4 divisions that Canelo has fought in since losing to Floyd. The 154-pound division, 160, 168, and 175 division. Now, granted, this is as of today. This could look very different in 6 months. This could look very different next year. So I'm basically just making this video solely based on what we have so far. In the 154 division, Jermell Charlo is 34-1, and he holds the WBA, WBC, and IBF titles, and Patrick Teixeira is 31-1, and he holds the WBO titles. Their record is a combined 65-2 for 97%, and their record in title fights is 6-1 with an 85.7% win percentage. Their opponent's record that they have fought throughout their careers is 170-12-2 for 92.4%. In the 160 division, you have 4 champions. You have Ryota Murata, who's 16-2 for the WBA. You have Jermell Charlo, who's 31-0 for the WBC. You have Gennady Golovkin, who's 41-1 with the IBF title and a former Canelo Alvarez foe. And you have Demetrius Andrade, who is 29-0, and he owns the WBO title. And the middleweight division record is 117-3-3 for 95%. And their record in title fights is 25-3-1 for 85.2%. And their opponents' records are a staggering 985, 87, and 15 for 90.6%. And we pretty much can be made aware that this record, in terms of the wins, is mostly being dragged along because of Gennady Golovkin's resume. So for the 168 division, you have Caleb Plant, who's 20-0 for the IBF, and Billy Joe Saunders, who's 30-0 for the WBO, with Canelo holding both the WBA and WBC titles in this division. Their record is a combined 50-0 for 100% win percentage, and their record in title fights is 9-0 for 100%. But when you look at their opponent's record, it's still pretty good. It's 263-20-5 for 91.3%. And last but not least, you have the light heavyweight division. And in this division, you have Dimitri Bivol, who's 17-0, and Artur Beterbiev, who is 15-0, and he owns the WBC and IBF titles, Bivol holding the WBA title. And the WBO title will be fought in a vacant fight with Maxim Vlasov versus Joe Smith Jr. But because there isn't a champion yet, I can't factor in their resumes. So when you look at the current light heavyweight resume, it's 32-0 for 100%. The record in title fights is 10-0 at 100%. And the opponent records are still pretty good for 2 guys who have less than 20 fights apiece. 224, 18-4 for 91.1%. Just to give you a comparison, Jermell Charlo and Patrick Teixeira have each fought more fights individually than Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev. However, when you look at the overall win column, Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev have fought guys who have had more wins than the guys that they have fought. So, and it also competes with the 168 division, where you have 2 guys who have 18 more wins in fights underneath their belt. So it's really interesting to see how these divisions have played out, because it not only means that they're fighting good opponents, but they're also fighting guys who also are pretty good on their own. So now we have to actually do some more deep diving. Something that needs to be further expanded on. Let's look at the comparisons to Canelo. So Canelo pre-Floyd, of course, had an 88.1% win percentage in terms of the opposition that he fought. And then afterwards, you see the 94.5% difference. When you look at the light heavyweight champs record, they have a 97% win percentage. And then you look at the light heavyweight champs opponent's record, they have a 92.4%. So you can make this hypothesis that the division of the light middleweights is performing at 0.2% better. And then you can compare the other divisions. Let's compare the middleweight division. That is performing at less than what would be considered standard, at minus 1.7% worse. Now, albeit we are factoring in Gennady Golovkin's loss to Canelo, which does drag this percentage down. But let's keep going, because we can ultimately continue to find more. So let's look at the super middleweight division, which is performing 1.15% better than what Canelo is competing at. And I really hate these sudden typos. I'll fix it afterwards. But yeah, 1.15%. So because of that, you look at that super middleweight division and you can tell that that division is operating slightly better than what Canelo is currently facing before and after. And then of course you look at the light heavyweight division, which is also performing very similarly. So now you look at, well, overall these divisions are performing close to 1% better than what Canelo is. So now let's also factor in Yildirim's record. And I'm not even touching if he loses or wins. I'm just factoring his record as it is. This actually lowers Canelo's percentage. It lowers his percentage by 0.2, which means that overall, a lot of these other divisions can suddenly start to get better. So what this does is it raises the light middleweight division from 0.2 to 0.4. It decreases the division where Canelo had fought for middleweight and captured roughly every title, and that drops the performance from 1.7 to 1.5. But it's these last two divisions that are very, very interesting because it raises it from 1.15 to 1.35, and then it raises it from 1.05 to 1.25. So overall, when you look at the key additions to each division, and if you were to average everything out, if the light heavyweights, super middleweights, and light middleweights all fought somebody who was slightly better than Anvil Yildirim's record, they would actually be fighting overall somebody twice as better than Anvil Yildirim, because that percentage goes from 0.7 to 1.5. And that's why a lot of people are criticizing, well, not that's why a lot of people, but that's why I can criticize this fight. That means that the division, all it needs to do is fight somebody who is better on paper than Anvil Yildirim and win. And doing that, they would have fought mathematically an opponent that is twice as better than Yildirim is for Canelo. So, in conclusion, Canelo has fought opponents that he had prior to losing Floyd and had fought better opponents, oppositions that he held. Canelo has fought opponents that he had prior to losing Floyd. And unlike Floyd's opposition, he got better, won more title fights and won more titles overall. However, the four divisions that he has fought since as of January of 2021 have kept up with him. And ultimately, the Anvil Yildirim fight allows other champs to potentially choose an opponent who can be considered record-wise and championship quality-wise twice as good as Anvil. So that's why people are not happy about this fight. And it's not what we think. It's not that we think that Anvil's a scrub, but compared to everybody else he could have been. So that's one of the big reasons why we don't really like this fight.